Well, it's good to be back. I mentioned earlier in the show I was in Washington, D.C. all this past week. I was participating in something called the Washington Ideas Forum. There's a group up there, the Atlantic Magazine, the Aspen Institute, a private nonprofit group that brings a cross-section of journalists, politicians, business leaders together to talk about new ideas and the future of the country. And it was interesting, particularly from some of the comments from the private sector. I'll tell you a guy I was very impressed with is Howard Schultz. He is the president of Starbucks. Came from the Bronx, worked his way up the ladder, just a basic guy who is the president of this huge conglomerate. I don't know if you know how big Starbucks is, but they have 17,000 stores in the U.S. alone. They're in 55 foreign countries. They serve 60 million customers a week, 11 million cups of coffee a day. And he gave some pretty interesting commentary on the focus in the country. He said, you know, the private sector has some awfully bright people, a lot of talk about Steve Jobs, who passed away, and so many others. But he said, is this the best we can do when it comes to the political leadership in this country today? And he was talking not just about the Democrats, but also about the Republicans. He said, with all of America's talent in the private sector, what happened to the public sector? He also talked about polarization in this country. He said politics should be a problem solving, not the polarization. And he said the differences now have become the reason to exist. That's the whole reason to exist, is to lay out your claim for these so-called principles that often clash in a way that drags the whole system down. We don't have a domestic agenda. He talked about the Marshall Plan. We visited a good bit about the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe and Asia after World War II. Congress had to be convinced that, look, this was in America's interest, and it was because of the massive markets we created. Schultz said, look, there's no way you'd have a Marshall Plan that would exist in this country or get through the Congress in this country today. It just would not happen. And then George Will, the columnist who writes in a number of papers throughout this country, made a comment last week. He said, look, you know, this polarization is good, that 80% of Americans are wrong. Washington's working. And Schultz made the point, which I agree. He says, man, what planet is he living on? I mean, Will is completely out of touch. He knows a lot about baseball, but he sure is missing the current mood in the country today. Schultz has said, don't give money to any of these politicians because all they're doing is representing the status quo. No change is coming about. $5.5 billion being spent in these elections for president as well as for Congress. And it's a whole generating activity. You see, the lobbyists raise the money, and they raise the money to keep their jobs. And then business wants to have, or all sides want to have influence in Washington. Money is the mother's milk of politics. These Tea Party types and all these good government types say they're going to go to Washington to make a change, and the first thing they do is start worrying about re-election and raising money from the K Street lobbyists to move towards that re-election. And so Schultz is saying, he's telling his fellow folks in the business world, just don't give any of these folks any money until they show a different agenda, different focus. The president's going to spend $1 billion to get reelected. $1 billion. And the other presidential candidates are raising money right and left. I know that's part of the system. You've got to do that to survive, to continue, if you're going to be successful. And I understand that. Guy who's getting no traction in the presidential race is our governor down in Louisiana, Buddy Roemer. Roemer, former governor, former congressman, says we ought to limit the contributions in his race for president. And some people think he's Don Quixote in his race because if without money, how are you going to generate any interest? He's saying he will not take more than $100 from any one individual. $100 is the limit. Hasn't raised very much money, is not getting very far. They ought to let Roemer in some of the debates. He'll raise that money issue and put all these other candidates on the spot. I think he'd be very articulate in a race for president, but it looks like he's not going to get any of the debates, which means he gets no traction, which means he's going nowhere. And so, in any event, I commend Howard Schultz. He's a bright business guy. He's run a very successful business with Starbucks, and he's making some pretty good political sense in terms of what ought to be happening in Washington, raising this interesting question, is this the best we can do with the choices we have today? Howard Schultz, I agree with you. I think we ought to do a lot better. Hey, I'll be right back.